All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Global Hotspots. The Global Hotspots series is co-sponsored by the Wisconsin Alumni Association, Plato, and the UW-Madison International Division. On behalf of all the sponsors, thank you for joining us today. My name is Terry Rayom, and I am a current UW-Madison student, as well as an alumni and donor engagement at the Wisconsin Alumni Association. I wanted to let you all know this is our last Global Hotspots for the year. We will be starting up again with them in February, so be on the lookout for that. And if you are on the lookout for any other alumni learning activities and lectures coming up, we do have our UW Showcase on December 3rd at Capitol Lakes. Global Hotspots, like I said, will pick up again in the beginning of February, and I will now pass the microphone over to Cynthia to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you. The International Division is very pleased to partner with the Wisconsin Alumni Association and Plato to bring you the Global Hotspot series. The role of the International Division is to leverage the expertise of a world-class public research university to advance the Wisconsin idea globally, applying knowledge and skills of the university to improve the lives of people near and far. Our support of the Global Hotspot series is part of sharing that mission, bringing together faculty experts for thought-provoking discussions that embody the commitment of the University of Wisconsin in service to the nation and to the world. Today, we will hear about a topic that we increasingly hear about in the news, water. Erica Simmons is a Lyons Family Faculty Scholar and Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Studies, and she's going to talk to us today about market reforms and water wars, the case of Cochabamba, Bolivia. Erica's research and teaching are motivated by an interest in contentious politics, particularly in Latin America. Simmons received an AB from Harvard College and a PhD from the University of Chicago. Her current work explores the intersection of market reforms and political resistance in the region, and her dissertation on the topic received the Latin American Studies Oxfam Martin Diskin Award. Her research has been funded by the Fulbright Commission and the Mellon Foundation and the Tinker Foundation, among others. So I'm going to turn it over to Erica. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you to, oh, that sounds really loud. Is that really loud? No, okay. Thank you to the Alumni Association and the International Studies Division, or the International Division, for the invitation to come and speak with you today. I'm really excited to share some of my research. The research I'm going to share with you today focuses on water privatization in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and a large resistance movement that emerged. But the project is situated in a broader set of questions about when and where and why people resist markets. Right? When we get privatizations, when we get impositions of free trade agreements or cuts in subsidies, eliminations of social safety nets, we get resistance sometimes in places and not in others. And so the research is really situated in this broader set of questions about how do we explore and think about when we get social movements that respond to increasing markets and when we don't. So with that, during the past 30 years, market-oriented economic reforms have swept much of the globe. Privatizations, free trade agreements, the elimination of subsidies, and cuts in social safety nets have dominated economic policy agendas. Some communities have met increasing marketization with relative quiescence. Some communities have voiced opposition along occupational or ethnic lines, and still others have come together across long-standing cleavages to mount widespread, broad-based resistance. On the one hand, some scholarship expects a failure to mobilize in the face of market reforms, emphasizing the disorganizing, sort of weakening or atomizing effects of market reforms. Other approaches, however, argue that market reforms can serve to repoliticize citizens, get them re-engaged in the political community. Neither perspective, I argue, however, offers a fully satisfying account of the varied responses to markets. Understandings of when and where we get resistance and when and where we do not, and what we might expect that resistance to look like, remains underdeveloped. So I explore these issues through a study of mobilizations against water privatization in Cochabamba, Bolivia in 1999 and 2000, events that came to be known as the water wars. In January 2000, thousands of Bolivians took to the streets to protest the privatization of the Cochabamban water supply. While mobilizations in Bolivia were not new, the protests in Cochabamba grew to a scope and scale that had been without precedent. The following events led up to the protests. The Bolivian government sold the right to the water of Bolivia's third largest city, Cochabamba, to a private firm, Aguas del Tunari, in June of 1999. The firm gained rights not only to Cochabamba's municipal water system, but also to water collected through private and communal wells. By the time ownership was transferred formally 5 months later, a cross-class, cross-ethnic, cross-urban rural movement demanding access to affordable water had taken hold in the region. In January, when water bills came due for water that had in some cases doubled in price, the water wars began, shutting down the city for days at a time. Protests spread throughout the country, and the government was forced to renationalize Cochabamban water by April. Now, although protest politics quickly quieted in the region, the Cochabamban movement was arguably the beginning of a period of political unrest in Bolivia that drove presidents from office and helped propel Evo Morales to the presidency 5 years later. So the 1999 privatization of water in Cochabamba brought Bolivians from every class, occupation, age, and ethnicity to the streets. It was not just those who suffered from the rate increases who protested the privatization. The mobilizations cut across long-standing urban-rural divides, as well as pre-existing class, sectoral, and ethnic cleavages. Bolivian researcher Rocio Bustamante argues that, and I'm quoting, almost the entire population of the region participated in the water wars, no matter what their social class. Robert Albro observes that during the water wars, and I'll quote again, diverse popular sectors and their respective cultural tactics combined as a plural political subject. But why did this mass protest occur when it did? And why was the composition of the movement so diverse? How and why was the formation of a plural political subject possible in this moment? So dominant approaches to the study of social movements provide an important foundation to understanding the events of the water wars. Mobilizing structures, political opportunities, and frames all undoubtedly played a role at various stages in the movement's emergence. Yet we cannot explain the emergence of the movement nor its plural composition by looking at these factors alone. So the photographs that you're looking at, I think, illustrate some of the dynamics happening. I particularly love this one on the left. We have a woman sort of dressed in traditional Quechua garb, and it's hard to tell, but what she's holding in her left hand is a slingshot. It's a homemade slingshot. She's got a rock in there, and she's facing off with the police during the protests. And then the photo on the right is the main plaza in Cochabamba, Bolivia, just taken over by the masses. This is a photograph from the April protests. And as you can see sort of some of the Bolivian flags dotting the streets, and we'll talk about nationalism and the role of nationalism in a minute, as well as some huifalas, which is sort of an pan-Andean indigenous symbol as well. They were all out in the streets there. So I interviewed the commander of the Cochabamban Bolivian Army Unit when I was doing fieldwork in Cochabamba, and this is one of my favorite quotes from the research. He said, "My wife, my child, my empleada, they were all in the streets." And for me, this was extremely sort of exemplified what was going on in that moment, right? The man in charge of essentially commanding the people who were supposed to go out and contain the protests was telling me that his wife and his child and his household worker were also all out there. And so for me, it was really a moment where I was like, that is extremely illustrative of what the feeling was in Cochabamba at the time. So when I looked at this movement, I thought about a number of questions. So there are really two central questions that emerged from the Cochabamba case. And first is motivated by Cochabamba itself. What accounts for the strong, broad-based, widespread opposition to the privatization of water in Cochabamba when earlier Bolivian privatizations and reforms had not generated contention on this scope or scale? Recall that Bolivia is now 15 years into a massive set of privatizations and other neoliberal economic reforms, right? So why now? What was happening in this moment that made Bolivia sort of start to explode? How do we explain the cross-class, cross-ethnic, and highly diverse nature of the movement? In particular, upper and middle-class mobilization was puzzling to me. Why did people who could easily afford a rate increase also take to the streets? To answer these questions, we must look to the claim at the center of the movement. I argue we have to understand the politics of water. Water helped to resolve what had been, in Schelling's terms, a coordination problem. Water emerged as a focal point, something that brought together diverse groups with diverse interests to fight for a common goal. But how and why did water play this role? Is there something unique about the physical properties of the good itself, its biophysical characteristics, its role in securing human physical survival? Or was there something more at stake? While the aspects of water's materiality play a role in how and why water worked the way that it did in Cochabamba, a focus on materiality alone leaves us asking questions about why threats to water provoke resistance in some times and places and not others. To understand why water worked the way it did, we must pay attention to what water meant in the Cochabamban context. So to situate you a little bit, I just want to give you a sense of everyone knows where Bolivia is, sort of located here between Peru, Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Access to the sea, of course, was cut off by Chile, which took the land to the north there. So Bolivia is landlocked. La Paz sits at the top of the Andes, right? 14,000 feet almost in El Alto, which is where the airport is. It's quite a ride in, if any of you have flown into the El Alto airport. Santa Cruz, on the other side of the country, in the east, is all the way down in the Amazon. So this country spans from 14,000 feet to sea level to the Amazon basin. It's pretty incredible. And Cochabamba is situated right in the middle. It's sort of not too high, not too low, just right. It's sort of surrounded by large valleys. It's got a very mountainous area, but not so high up that you're experiencing the sort of extreme weather conditions that you experience in either the Amazon or in La Paz, in the high Andes. So this focus on water in the Cochabamba case allows me to make a broad set of propositions, beginning with the idea that to address questions of social movement emergence and dynamics in response to markets, we must focus not only on the political context and resources available to potential social movements, so who's the president at the time, what kinds of elite cleavages are happening, what are the organizations that are on the ground. These are all the things that social movement scholars tend to look at normally. So I'm saying those are important, but they miss something. We also have to think about what people perceive to be at stake during marketization. These perceptions influence mobilization processes and the kinds of groups available for mobilization. So when we understand markets as threatening not only to material well-being, but also to widely shared community relationships and understandings and commitments, those heightened feelings of group belonging can contribute to broad-based mobilization. So the argument is essentially that we cannot divorce economic relationships, processes, and practices from the ideas with which they are imbued. Markets create very real material effects, but they are also constituted by the ideas we have about them and about the ideas we have about the goods that they regulate. So water helps to produce and reproduce conceptions of regional rights and communal identity for many Cochabambans, regardless of their occupation or place of residence within the Cochabamba Valley. Not surprisingly, the meanings water has taken on in the Cochabamban context are multiple, varied, and sometimes contradictory. Yet for many Cochabambans, water works to symbolize something more than its biophysical characteristics. Cochabamba's history of and contemporary experiences with scarcity, combined with both irrigation practices and understandings of an agricultural past, to imbue water with meanings tied to local and regional identities. The privatization contract evoked a resistance rooted in broad community needs and relationships, which were expressed in familiar, long-standing discourses. So to many Cochabambans, water was not only a critical component of their continued livelihood, but also a good that took on national, regional, and ethnic significance. The Aguas del Trinari contract, so the privatization contract, not only threatened relationships with a critical material good, but also imagined communities of nation, region, and ethnicity, as well as what I'm calling quotidian communities, communities constituted by face-to-face, daily interactions where members know each other directly. So it's created by everyday social interactions and relationships. As a result, for the first time since 1985, when the market reforms began, Cochabambans from every age, barrio, class, sector, and ethnicity came together in the streets. So I want to talk a little bit about these concepts of imagined and quotidian communities here. This isn't purely a story about how nationalism or other imagined identifications help to generate social mobilization. Instead, it's an argument about the very moments in which imagined identifications are brought to the fore as salient categories, about how group identifications are summoned by a particular kind of threat in a particular way. So here, the idea that water belonged to Bolivians intersected powerfully with local notions that water was a critical component of regional heritage, local autonomy, and sacred practice. Regional, national, and ethnic identifications converged to produce widespread mobilization. So differences were both recognized and contained through the claims presented in mobilization as protesters defended what was theirs, the water that was theirs. From national governmental officials who at once symbolized a threat to Cochabamba, to the Bolivian nation, and to sacred Andean practice. And I chose this photograph for this particular slide. Because what we've got is a guerrero, a water guerrero from Los Tiempos, the Cochabamba newspaper. Photographer took this, and he's running into the center of the plaza, and he's holding this stick. And tied to the stick is not only the Bolivian flag, but also the Andean huifala. And so for me, this sort of symbolized a moment in which nation and the struggles around nation and claims for indigenous autonomy, right, within the Bolivian nation came together, such that you weren't making claims against the Bolivian state by holding the huifala, you were making claims that were together, right? You were both claiming your right as a Bolivian and claiming your right as a member of a sacred sort of set of Andean, feelings of a long-term set of Andean belonging. So here the huifala and the Bolivian flag, something that don't often appear side by side, but often appear in conflict, are held together and represent a similar set of claims. But to threaten water also tapped into what I'm calling quotidian communities. These are face-to-face, primary communities where interactions are direct and personal. So in Karen Bacher, a geographer's language, water was an artisanal good for many Cochabambans. People interacted directly and routinely with it through its cultivation and distribution. So drawing on Bourdieu's conception of habitus, I argue that these processes help to structure social worlds, and through them relationships that help to constitute conceptions of community were forged. Water was imbued with specifically social meanings that emerged around these quotidian communities, meanings that were produced and reproduced by direct, iterated encounters that took place with water as a central reference point. The idea here is that the marketization of water disrupted these routine, quotidian, daily encounters, disrupting networks or practices that had given water meaning beyond its material role. So it was a threat not just to nation or region, but to the relational fabric of routine community interactions. And so I have two examples from the Cochabamban context that I want to talk through. And one has to do with local governments, and the other is these sort of routine personal interactions. So the first here, the photograph on my right, your left, is of a local water council in the southern zone of Cochabamba getting together to dig a trench for a new water pipe to bring water to their community. And what this photograph shows is first the absence of the state in this moment. The state has failed to provide water to their particular community. But then the community has gone out and tried to provide it themselves. So they get together, they pay weekly dues, right? They have weekly meetings, they get together, decide what needs to be done, they contribute their labor as well as their earnings, their wages, in order to make this happen. And so here, they're getting together in order to help provide water for themselves. Well, this creates those kinds of routine, daily, quotidian interactions that I'm talking about, where your sense of self, sense of autonomy, sense of dignity, sense of community, all comes and is forged through water as this sort of central focal point. The photo on the other side here, it's a little bit hard to tell. This doesn't look like a well in sort of bucolic rural Wisconsin, but this is what many water wells look like in Cochabamba. This is also in the southern zone. And what we're looking at is a concrete well that's been also constructed by a community and is regulated by that community. You can't really see it too easily, but there's a little lock on the corner there, right? So the well is locked and closed at most times of the day and night. It might open, say, on Monday and Wednesday from 2 to 4, right? And during that time, if you've paid your dues to your local water cooperative, right, you can go and get water from that well. What happens during these moments is that you get routine personal interactions where people are waiting in line every Monday and Wednesday or Tuesday and Thursday or whatever it is to get their water. See each other, You wait for maybe, I don't know, 20 minutes, half an hour, 2 hours. Ask about the weather. How is your grandmother? You know, I heard your daughter was skipped school the other day. You know, what's happening? How'd that go? You know, oh, I heard your kid is going to La Paz to go to university. Congratulations, tell me about it. Right? It's a place for these kinds of routine communal interactions to happen. And they happen around water, which is not insignificant. So these relationships develop, right? Your sense of community then gets tied to relational practices around water. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk you through some of the key developments of the water wars, right? The way in which the water wars developed by paying careful attention to what water meant in the Cochabamban context. We can explain why groups were able to come together to create new resources, to capitalize on political opportunities, and to employ master frames that were broadly resonant. So attention to the meanings of water, the meanings it took on in the Cochabamban context, helps to understand the dynamics of the contentious processes at work. So first I'll talk about the initial broad-based alliance that started the movement. It was called CODAEP. Then I'll talk about the Coordinadora, which was the main organizational vehicle driving the movement. And then finally, I'll step back and talk a little bit about the resonance of national, regional, communal, and ethnic frames that cut across salient divisions and brought Cochabambans to the streets. So just after the Aguas del Tunari concession was signed, formal opposition began with the founding of the Committee for the Defense of Water and the Popular Economy, a group comprised largely of local professionals, economists, engineers, architects, environmentalists. It's impossible to explain the emergence of CODAEP without engaging the role that water had played in Cochabamba's recent and extended history, and what it meant to Cochabamba's professional sector in particular. So while CODAEP's founders anticipated that rates would rise, most members would not have to make life-altering material trade-offs in order to pay their bills. Members were largely comfortable, middle-class, urban Cochabamban professionals. Yet the central role that water had played in the region and the conception that privatization meant far more than potential rate hikes was similarly shared. The contract was understood as a betrayal of a long regional effort to secure and distribute a sustainable water supply. So for nearly 50 years, Cochabamban engineers, architects, environmentalists, economists, and lawyers had all been researching and advocating for various solutions to the region's limited access to water. Communities commissioned studies on water table depth, and debates took place over well construction. Studies about water loss and quality, as well as corruption within the municipal water system, made front-page news regularly. And every year, as the dry season reached its final weeks, conversations revolved around water. How many days a week people were receiving it, how much sediment came in it, and whether they would make it to the rains without a massive shutdown. Contemporary drought intersected with idealized notions of a verdant, paradise-like past to heighten water's role in the Cochabamban imaginary. In the post-glacial period, the valley of Cochabamba was in fact a large lake. Indeed, the name Cochabamba comes from the Quechua words for lake, Cocha, and plain, Pampa. The name is a reflection of what made the Cochabamba Valley such a popular place for early settlers. The combination of water and plains made for a particularly fertile region. Cochabamba's water served to help turn the region into the breadbasket of the country, fueling Bolivia's growth by providing grains to the miners that drove the country's development through both the silver and the tin mining booms. So Cochabambans speak of this role with great pride and nostalgia. The region's history of cultivation produces notions of regional self-worth, and recollections of it are infused with national pride, right? This idea that we in Cochabamba are responsible for our country's growth by helping to feed the miners through these critical moments. So every CODAEP founder interviewed for this research offered a lengthy treatment of how water had been a constant reference in both personal and professional life. For many of Cochabamba's professionals, water was part of a regional identity, both with respect to historically grounded pride in cultivation and recent efforts to overcome shortages. The Aguas del Tunari contract was understood as an insult to the region, perpetrated by officials in La Paz with no respect or understanding for what the region deserved. Engineer Antonio Siles remarked, "We had been the breadbasket of the country. Of course water was central to our lives. When they published the Aguas del Tunari contract, the Engineers Society had to do an evaluation, and it was simply a bad project. After all these years, we deserved a better project. So the Coordinadora then becomes formed. It goes on to serve as the key organizational vehicle. And attention to water's meanings explain why the unprecedented alliance that the Coordinadora represented was possible. So pre-existing organizations were central to the rise and reach of the Coordinadora. One of these was the Regantes, or the Irrigators Union. Regantes not only make a living controlling and conducting water to irrigate fields, they also develop spiritual and personal connections with the resource. The usos y costumbres, which sort of loosely translates as traditions and customs, vary from valley to valley within the Department of Cochabamba. In rural and peri-urban settings, both places where irrigation practices are common, usos y costumbres might refer to the specific rules of a particular community governing who has access to how much water and when, right? So you might have a group of irrigators who get together and decide that you get water from this particular canal on this particular day of the week for this number of hours, right? So they have all of these rules about who can get water when and how, and you have to have paid your dues to the local community in order to participate. Water is the fundamental organizing principle for many of these rural and peri-urban communities. Elaborate, complex, highly structured systems of obligations, rights, responsibilities, and justice govern relationships with water sources. Water literally serves to produce and reproduce the quotidian communities I was talking about earlier, serving as the motivating force for governance structures and regular communal interactions. But water may also index a connection to the past, or a broader Andean or irrigator community. The concept of usos y costumbres is grounded in a connection to the past. Many Cochabambans, irrigators and otherwise, claim that usos y costumbres reflect the actual practices of generations of Cochabambans. The particular systems and management practices to which usos y costumbres refer remain important, but the concept has come to signify a connection with Andean custom, cultural autonomy, and independence from state intervention in communal governance. Usos y costumbres simultaneously refers to the physical practices surrounding water use and management, and broader claims of perceived water rights, autonomy, and self-governance. So water is more than simply a source of income or a component of physical nourishment for Cochabamba and Regantes. It serves as a connection to an immediate network that gives meaning to everyday life, as well as to a broader Regante community and a uniquely Andean past and present. Many Regantes understood the Aguas del Tunari contract to put these systems and the relationships developed around them, many rooted in imagined communities connected to a broadly Andean indigenous identification, at risk. The Regantes then join with CODAEP, the organization I talked about earlier, to mount a series of blockades in October and early November. So the contract has yet to come into effect, but it's been signed, and they decided to set up a bunch of blockades. The Regantes then call a meeting to think about next steps. The meetings brought Regantes and CODAEP together with the Factory Workers Union, the Departmental Workers Union, so essentially the state union, the Teachers Union, the Transportation Workers Union, the Campesinos, so the Peasants Union, the local neighborhood organizations, so think about all the water councils, and many others. They founded what they called the Coordinator for the Defense of Water and Life, which turned into the central organizational vehicle for the movement. The alliance spanned not only urban-rural divides, which ran deep in Cochabamba, but also social and class boundaries. So water's historical and contemporary roles in the region combined, allowing water to be perceived as shared by groups as disparate as Regantes, factory workers, and business owners. They used a language of us that you had not seen before, as if a sort of new community was emerging in that moment, where people were understanding themselves to belong to a new community that they had not associated with prior. So here's a quote from a Fabriles worker and a founder of the Coordinadora. He says, "Before, we tried to resist the pension reform, so an earlier privatization scheme that got implemented, but it was only us, just the workers. But water is everywhere. It belongs to everyone and no one. It is part of our history, part of who we are, all of us in Cochabamba. It was like giving a piece of our territory away. So of course we came together. So water's historical and contemporary roles in the region combine, allowing this sort of imaginary that brings everyone together. And on January 11th, Cochabambans took to the streets in response to the Coordinadora's call, mounting what they called the Blockade for Dignity. Of course, language that is now not lost on you in terms of thinking of the ways in which water helped to produce and reproduce dignity in the region. The central government called in hundreds of police officers to control the march to the Central Plaza, and they attempted to reopen roads, but the protesters stayed put. So it should already be clear that frames, the language that we use to describe a movement, the slogans people chant in the streets, the way in which we sort of pitch a social movement to a particular group to try and recruit new members, or perhaps to try and convince people to be on our side, that these frames were really important in the movement. What I hope to have begun to show, however, is that already established understandings of water are what made these extremely resonant frames possible. So frames revolved around the idea that el agua es nuestra, the water is ours, or of the people, del pueblo, right? As seen as the photographs shown here. A frame of us or the people is possible because water is conceived of as something that is broadly shared. So I'm a particular fan of this one, where we get el agua es del pueblo carajo, which is like the water is of the people, damn it. And what I quite like about it is that you've also got on the other side these police officers who are not just ordinary Cochabamban police officers. As you recall, the commander of the Cochabamban military was not so psyched to send out his own troops because his wife, his child, and his empleada were also out on the streets. So the folks from La Paz sent in sort of the equivalent of the National Guard. They were called the Dalmatas, and you can tell why, right? They have these uniforms that make them look a little bit like Dalmatians. And it felt again like this violation of local sovereignty, right? This violation that people from La Paz were coming in and sending their troops to try and control and contain, something that Cochabambans wanted to decide for themselves. And of course, on this side, we have a very famous photograph from the last days of the protest. This is hanging outside of the Coordinadora's main office, and it says, el agua es nuestra carajo. And we've got all of the Coordinadora leaders on the top up there, flags dotting the streets. You've got the Huifala and the Bolivian flag again in this photograph. And so all of these frames combine and become critical. So an additional frame, evidenced in slogans, but also perhaps most powerfully in the Bolivian flag, is the dotted the streets, often serving as the front line as protesters march down the street. So there are wonderful images of protesters essentially moving forward in large groups with huge flags in front of them, sort of literally framing a divide between them and the police in front of them. And they were shielding themselves with their own nationality, right, with the Bolivian flag in front of them, essentially claiming the flag as something that was theirs. So these Bolivian flags that served as the front line as protesters marched down the streets was possible because of the way in which water was understood as patria, which loosely translates as homeland. Interviewees routinely referred to water as patria and stated that to violate water was to violate our sovereignty. One protester recalled that they took the plaza in the name of Bolivia. The state forfeits the flag when they don't do their job. The people raised the flag because they were defending the country. But the indigenous Huifala appeared almost as frequently. The perceived threat to water tapped in not only to national, but also clearly ethnic identifications. The notion that usos y costumbres had been violated appear routinely in movement rhetoric, appealing directly to connections with a broader Andean community. Importantly, these frames resonated not only with regantes, as described earlier, but with factory workers and middle-class condo owners who also spoke of the importance of preserving usos y costumbres, a connection to the past, a desire to preserve an idea of culture. Again, these frames were only possible because of the places that water had in local understandings and practices, and how those practices were connected to a sense of an Andean cosmovision. So to defend water was to defend country, the region, and cultural practice, something that Cochabambans deserved, this idea to decide for themselves how they were going to get their water, and that the central government couldn't come in and impose these decisions on them. Water could be described as belonging to Bolivians, as a particular right of Cochabambans, or a reflection of Andean custom in a way that previous market reforms could not. At the end of the third day of protests, government representatives and movement leaders were ready to sit down to negotiate, and protesters returned home. While other dynamics took hold as they took to the streets again in February and again in April, and as I already said, were ultimately achieved their goal, at least, of getting the private company kicked out. What water meant to Cochabambans explains why they came together to form a movement in late 1999 and early 2000. So I see a number of sort of avenues for future research and theoretical work that can engage in this. And part of it is thinking more broadly about how we understand the claims that social movement leaders are making, right? So when we analyze and think about social movements as scholars, we look at political context, we look at organizational resources, we look at the frames that I just talked about. But very rarely do we actually explore, and this may sound strange, but this is where the literature has been, very rarely do we look at the claims the movement is making to understand who it can access, why, and how, right? And so I've essentially argued that what we need to do is think about the claims the movement is making, the grievances at work, as not just the physical thing that you're looking for, that you're trying to seek, right? But as also being imbued with all sorts of ideas, right? And that those ideas matter, and those ideas are going to help us better understand why we get protests around rising corn prices in Mexico, and we don't get protests around rising corn prices in Japan, right? That we have to understand what corn means in the Mexican context in order to understand how it's going to work to provoke resistance. I also think that we can think about potential patterns around water. So the way in which water indexed community in Cochabamba suggests that broader theorizing on the intersection of water and contention is warranted. So there might be systematic ways to understand when and where a threat to water might work to produce mobilized resistance and when it might not, right? So we can take this case and look at all kinds of other moments of water privatization practices, of other interference with local water practices, and try and understand better why in some moments communities don't mobilize and in some moments they do. Furthermore, I think the research suggests that we can think about other kinds of claims that may work to symbolize community in similar ways, right? So my central contention is the way that water symbolized community is what helped to mobilize resistance in that moment. So what else symbolizes community? What are the other things that are out there that might be part of daily life that can take on these meanings that we might want to look at and think about as scholars? So in particular, the practices through which Cochabambans imbued water with meaning suggest that any good at the center of daily life and practice might come to work in similar ways. So the daily practices that have emerged around water in Cochabamba are rooted in the good's role in the historical and contemporary subsistence, right? So here the material and the ideational combine. It's because of water's critical material role in the region that it took on all of those ideational roles that I talked about. So it's because of water's role in material life that it plays a central role in daily practices and cultural imaginings. This suggests that any subsistence resource, a good at the center of routine, communal, material practice, might come to symbolize neighborhoods, regions, nations, or ethnic groups in the way that water did in Cochabamba. I take up this challenge in my book, due out in April, by looking more broadly at subsistence, marketization, and contention, and make the claim that subsistence goods are particularly likely to play a role in the kind of community production that I described in Cochabamba. Thank you very much. I'm open to questions, comments, reactions. Yeah.
One interesting phenomenon of Bolivian case is that you have a very small elite class. And
You mean at the top of governance in Bolivia?
at the top.
Yep.
My point is that they tend to be interrelated. So you might have a member of the Communist Party who's related to somebody that's an officer in the army. So that might be one reason why this multi-class movement developed, because you have a sort of very tiny but mutually interconnected set of people at the top.
Well, so I'm trying to understand. At that moment in Bolivia, so in 1999, 2000, we have Hugo Banzer in the presidency. He's part of the Conservative Party. He's actually a former military dictator who was then elected through regular democratic elections. And I actually have another paper where I look at and think about the ways in which this sort of ruling coalition that he was a part of had become so removed from Bolivian popular classes that they had no idea really what people were thinking or what their interests were. And this helps to explain the rise of Evo Morales, right? That we essentially get elected officials that people feel like aren't representing them, right? And so they end up rejecting the 3 existing political parties that had been around for quite some time because they ultimately feel like in those political parties there's no one to represent them. And so you get this huge sort of set of removal from the political elites at the time, in spite of the fact that they were supposed to be democratically elected representatives, the people didn't really feel represented. And so then you get broad connections of the people who don't feel represented, and that makes that possible. So I don't know if that quite addresses it, but.
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Yeah? Oh, sorry.
The picture you showed there was a part of 2 pictures. One was a square well.
Mm-hmm.
What, 2 things, what are those used for primarily, and how ubiquitous are they in the city?
Yeah, so they're throughout. You have 2 sets of different types of wells in Cochabamba, and one are constructed by the elite, who don't trust the municipal water network, which, granted, was not very good. It was very poor at providing service. The municipal water networks had enormous water leakages. You couldn't count on them, and so you get the wealthy class in Cochabamba that drills wells, but not like that. They get to drill wells in their own private home backyard, right, where they get to go down and use them every day. The wells that I showed are largely in the southern zone of Cochabamba and a little bit in the northwest, zones that are much poorer, and they're constructed by these community governance councils, right? And so they're all over the place. You might have, I don't know, one every, half mile, right, where people might go and then stand in line and use them, and they use it for all of your daily water needs, absolutely every single one. So drinking, bathing, washing, you name it.
Okay, so how do you relate that to just the general concept of the commons, like in historically grazing in commons and timber harvesting in commons in the eastern United States historically? Do you relate that pretty closely to that?
So I do. I use some of Eleanor Ostrom's work in my work, and she's one of the people who sort of talked about how the commons get used, and I think about it in terms of the ways in which people have come together in order to get access to a community, something that they consider a community resource, but that they also think that in order to get access to that community resource, you need to contribute, right? That it's a communal resource that belongs to all of us, but if we're going to put in the labor and the time and the effort to make sure that well is working, that you also need to contribute as well, right? So I do think of it as a common pool resource, but one that ultimately gets well managed and not overused or overexploited because people put their own regulation systems in place in places like Cochabamba. And this actually happens throughout the Andes, these sorts of practices. Mm-hmm.
California is in the midst of a water crisis
Yes,
right now.
it is.
But we have not seen any such mass movements.
No.
What factors mitigate against that, in your view? And are we likely to see any of it in the future?
That is a great question. I've done a little bit of thinking about this, and I'm not sure I have a great answer. But one of the things that happens in the United States very broadly is that for a very long time, most of us have access to water through a tap in our homes that we simply open and close. And this geographer that I quoted earlier, Karen Backer, calls that an industrial relationship with water, right? Where you're not working very hard to get it every day. You might be told that you can't water your lawn in California, or that you can't take a 3-hour shower, or I'm belittling it. I'm sure it's challenging. But it's still not the same sort of extraordinary force of labor that's required here, right? Where you're thinking about it in terms of how you're going to get it every day. You might spend 2 hours of your day investing your time and making it happen. You go to these local governance meetings. And so you don't get this sense of communal identity in quite the same way. I think there is something that's happening in California that creates some sort of communal bond. It becomes a source of daily conversation, right? Everyone's talking about it all the time. And that produces some kind of connection. But I don't think it's enough to generate any sort of large-scale mobilization. We've also got, sort of unrelated to the research, but related to thinking about where and why we get social movements, there's no clear target in California, right? What are you going to mobilize against? Here we had a really clear target. We had a company that people could hate. And even if they didn't agree on the solution to Cochabamba's water problems, because let me tell you, once they kicked out Aguas del Ternari and they were in charge again, it was a total mess. So they could not figure out how to implement a sustainable system themselves. But they had a clear target at that moment. And I don't know who the target would be in California. Sort of, are we gonna rise up and, I don't know, fight global warming, some people think global warming is responsible, some people think it's the agricultural sector, some people think it's and so I think that also makes it hard to think about a large-scale social movement happening in this moment.
Is it on? Yes. Just talking about the effect of economics and social movements, I'm reminded of something that happened in Chile, a country I'm a little more familiar with than Bolivia, although I know Bolivia a little bit. I'm talking about the middle class and the working class together, mostly the middle class housewives, march during the government of Salvador Allende. Mm-hmm. And they marched down the street. I know I was there not long afterwards, and I talked to a lot of people working middle class, and they talked about the fact that you could not get any chicken to eat, you couldn't get anything.
Right.
And they marched down the street, and they got beat up by the Allende army.
By the Allende army?
Yes. And that's one of the issues that brought about the military coup. Huh. Because the government of Chile, the military in Chile historically was very traditional and was not prone to coups at the drop of a hat.
No, that's right.
And they were very upset to see these soldiers beating up wives of many of their young officers, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. It's a little more complicated than that, but you'd have to say that that movement, which was gathered mostly because you couldn't get anything in the store.
Yeah.
And it really had a big effect on the government. On the other hand, if you look at Venezuela today, you have this, great all these economic problems, and all these people almost the same way as Chile, but somehow not enough of an effort to be able to move anything, at least in the short run. In the long run, maybe it will, but I'm just wondering about when you talk about the intervening effect of economics on social movements, this is a small one, but there's big ones. I don't know if you've looked at any other countries beside Bolivia.
Yeah, so I actually, the book looks at Bolivia and looks at Mexico. And what I try and do is make some of these connections around economics and how the things that we buy, that we need to survive, and that we think about needing to survive every day can take on these sort of these ideational elements that take on meaning beyond what we need them to survive for, right? And so I don't know the Chilean case all that well, particularly, I know something about the protests under Allende before the Pinochet coup, but I don't know sort of all of the ideational aspects involved in sort of what exactly people were protesting about and how. But I can speak to the fact that I think that would be a good question to ask and something worth looking into, right? That there might be something in that case that we can think about in terms of the ways in which access to particular goods at particular moments made people feel particularly insecure. Now in Venezuela, there are all kinds of mobilizations happening in Venezuela right now, and of course it made the news in very splashy ways last February, March, and April. It seems to have quieted down again now, but we'll see. Of course, one of the biggest protests in Venezuelan history happened around rising transportation costs, right? Which is something that I don't put in the traditional subsistence good bucket, but I'd be fascinated to think about and explore because of the ways in which transportation, so the ability to have an affordable bus ride to your job every day, plays a huge role in your ability to provide for your family. And so then it takes on this additional ideational element. So it would be something I would like to toy around with. The protests in Brazil also started, right, with an increase in bus fare. And so how do we think about how transportation might or might not draw on some of the things that I've talked about here? So I don't know, but thank you. Are there new ones or no? There's one in the back here, and then we'll come. Oh.
Yeah, I was going to say regarding the question of, I guess, what they call in Spanish, the cacerolas, the marches of the empty pots. They're also,
yeah.
It's not very well known, but there took place similar demonstrations in Cuba, I think in Cardenas, just after the revolution. But we don't hear about those because those were immediately repressed by the Cuban authorities.
My question is this. There was a great honeymoon when Morales initially took office, but his name has been largely absent from the international news of late. So is he still regarded as a progressive, or has there been discontent that's risen regarding him?
This is a great question. Morales' rule has been, that's sort of not even a fair word. Morales' time in office has been extremely fraught and very complex. And he has disappointed a whole range of people because he made a whole range of promises that were then very hard to live up to. And I'm much more familiar with one than with others because it's sort of part of my next set of research questions is revolving around thinking about the intersection between the promises that Morales made around redistribution, the promises he's made around indigenous autonomy, and then the need of the economy to rely on natural gas extraction in order to survive. And so we've got a really interesting intersection where you've got a president who's made commitments to indigenous groups saying, yes, I respect your territorial sovereignty, this is important, this is something I care about, I'm an indigenous president, and he self-identifies as that all the time, right, through his dress, through his language, through his everything, right? And then running roughshod over those commitments, because what drives the engine of Bolivian economic growth? Well, right now it's natural gas. And so if your indigenous sovereign territory is in the way of me extracting gas, I am gonna pretend like I didn't say the things I did 5 years ago about commitments to indigenous territorial sovereignty. So it's been extremely complicated. He has alienated indigenous leaders, he's alienated people on the left, people on the right hated him to begin with, and I think he will retain favor for quite some time, but what's most challenging from a political scientist's perspective about what's happening in Bolivia is the absence of an alternative at this point. And so we talk a lot in political science about the need for political parties as institutions for channeling voice, right? And Bolivia still is without a political party on the other side. The MAS remains the dominant party without having anything emerge that becomes something that people feel like they can use to channel, contest. Lots of little pockets of little things emerging, but no sort of strong, unified, Democrat, Republican, ADN, MNR, whatever, PRI, PAN, whatever your parties are gonna be, like, we're not seeing that happening. And that, from a political scientist perspective, becomes troubling in terms of thinking about the importance of the contestation of political power and having alternative channels for people to voice their concerns. These are the moments when we start thinking that you're going to get a lot more social mobilization and social unrest. There was one in the back earlier, yeah.
About 5 years ago, there were a lot of people on the streets here in Madison, Wisconsin.
Yes, that's right.
And I wonder if you see any patterns between those two events. And the other portion is there was nobody marching on the streets when we had the potential destruction of the Wisconsin idea or the open records. But perhaps there's some relationship with the social media that wasn't present in those things that you're studying that might be more relevant to the issue that you're dealing with in the United States.
So those are lots of good questions. I had just gotten my job offer from the University of Wisconsin at Madison a month before the protest started. My husband looked at me, he goes, oh my God, are you gonna have a job in 6 months? We turned down those other offers and all of a sudden you're gonna be left without anything. We still came and it all worked out, we were fine. And it's been really fun to teach students. I teach a class in contentious politics, so social movements, revolutions, and riots. And it's been great to have students, they're now all graduating soon, who were here for it because they can talk about what it was like to see those protests. I think protests around the labor movement here are largely a different kettle of fish in terms of how we think about how, when, where, and why they come about. It's certainly something, what we can take from my research to learn about and think about those protests is the ideational element of it all, right? The power of the ideas with which labor is imbued in this country, and it's changed over time, shifted dramatically, right? So you think about songs like We're Sticking to the Union, being a rallying cry of extraordinary pride among a very large population 50, 60, 70 years ago in a way that now they are extremely questioned, right? So ideas shift, cultures shift, and the culture around sort of how people think about what unions are and what they do has changed enormously. And so those protests were an exceptional moment that ultimately didn't turn into a large-scale, sustained movement beyond the recall campaign, as far as I can tell. And I think part of that has to do, and part of what made Act 10 possible to begin with, is the ways in which ideas around labor have begun to shift. In terms of recent protests around, I can add changing the UW budget to your list of potential grievances that we might have expected more mobilization around. And I think the answer there is going to be one that's frustrating, but reveals the challenge of studying social movements, is that there's a whole lot of contingency involved when we see social mobilizations. A lot of things have to come together in the right way and the right time. Social movements are not something that we as scholars are very good at predicting, right? All of my colleagues that studied the Middle East 3 years ago were like, 4 years ago, how long was it? Or like Arab uprising, no. We got durable dictatorships in that region. We're never gonna see this sort of thing happen, right? We're not very good at predicting large-scale social movements because so many different factors need to come together. It has to be the right political opening at the right moment. The right resources have to be available in terms of the right networks of people. And then that right sort of spark or grievance that is imbued with the right kinds of ideas that sets things off. And so I don't know what's happening around why people are not enraged enough to take to the streets around these questions. It's challenging.
We have time for one more quick question if anyone has.
So there were a lot of unlikely alliances that formed, obviously in that water wars. Is there any sense of like a residual unity, any of these alliances that have persisted after things kind of went back to normal, whatever that is?
To end on a depressing note, no, the alliances fell apart extremely quickly, and it's really sad as someone who cares about this region very much and spent a lot of time there to have watched things fall apart. The head of Fabriles, a guy named Oscar Oliveira, who was sort of one of the big leaders at the time, supported by Evo Morales. He and Morales now, hate each other and have wars in the media with each other all the time. The Engineer Society thinks that everyone went the wrong direction in terms of the answer to the water problem. So they're fighting with the local union officials who were in charge. They essentially took over the municipal water company with a sort of community-based cooperative. And everybody fought, and nobody could figure out what to do. And so I think one of the other sort of, I would say, completely intuitive things to think about from this particular moment is the ways in which it's a whole lot easier to fight against something and be unified against something than to be unified in a solution for something. And nobody came together with a good solution. And every time I go to Cochabamba to do research, it looks the same in terms of the kind of access that people have to water and where. So it's not all, I have a TA that likes to say it's not all flowers and butterflies with social movements. Ultimately, who knows? Maybe the Aguas del Tunari company would have provided better water services than they've been able to accomplish now. I don't know, and I sort of remain agnostic on that question, but it's really depressing to think about. And these kinds of questions happen throughout Latin America, throughout the developing world. Water privatization has fallen off as something that's sort of trendy. The World Bank is no longer promoting it in the way that it was, but people still haven't figured out how to get water to people in places where they need it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And let us give one
Thank
more round
you.
of applause.